In 1845, a mining town in Pennsylvania ceased digging for coal and began digging for the impossible. They believed they had discovered a cave. But what emerged from the ground was no cavern. Half buried in mud, coated in dust, carved with impossible precision, stood a pyramid upside down, its tip buried deep beneath the earth, as if the world itself were trying to hide it. The miners called it the geometry beneath. The government called it classified, and after that year, the town of Dewan, Pennsylvania, was erased from every map. But why? What did they uncover beneath that soil that someone wanted buried forever? Look closely at this photograph, because what you're about to see should not exist. Step into the fiery night. Subscribe now and stay until the end, because in this story, the last detail changes everything. Discovered in 1911, the letter was folded inside a rusted tin box, sealed beneath the collapsed shaft of the Dequan mine. Its author, Inspector Nathaniel Greaves, was last seen on the morning of October 12, 1843, the day the miners struck what he described only as an unnatural pattern in the earth. The handwriting trembles, the ink soaked unevenly through the paper as if written underground by candlelight. Asterisk, we have found a structure, sir. It is no part of the mine. The men say the stone breathes. Greaves. October 11, 1843, asterisk. The story begins in the hills of Carbon County, Pennsylvania, where the Daquin Mining Company had opened a new coal vein 3 miles east of the town. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, the air so thick with soot that candles seemed to suffocate mid-burn. Yet that morning, a sound echoed through the tunnels that no pickaxe could make, a hollow, metallic resonance, rhythmic, deliberate. When the dust cleared, the miners saw a flat black surface running diagonally through the stone wall, smooth, cold, and carved. Greaves was called down from the upper station to inspect it. Witnesses said he knelt before the surface, brushing away soot with the back of his glove. "It's slate," one miner whispered. Greaves shook his head. "Not slate. Something older." Beneath the lamplight, faint carvings emerged, lines forming perfect angles, a symmetry too exact for accident. A triangle inverted into the earth itself. That evening, Greaves returned to the surface to send his report to Harrisburg. The company foreman later testified that the inspector was a changed man, his eyes unfocused, his words short, his hands clutching a folded page as though it were burning through his skin. In his final note, written only hours before his disappearance, Greaves described standing within the shaft as the walls seemed to hum. He wrote of the men lowering a lantern into the newly cut opening. The flame bent inward, pulled by something unseen. "It was not a cave we uncovered," his letter concluded. Asterisk, it was built. Asterisk. The following morning, the miners returned to find the opening sealed. No stone fragments, no debris, just smooth black rock cool to the touch, as though the earth had healed itself overnight. Greaves was gone. His office left undisturbed, his bed unmade. Only his coat remained, hanging by the door, dusted with black ash. The letter ends with a single unfinished line, a sentence cut mid-word, as if the ink had run dry. The pattern continues downward, and beneath it, the tin box containing his letter was retrieved decades later during an unauthorized excavation. Inside were traces of red clay and soot, and the faint imprint of a triangle pressed into the metal lid. Even now, no one can explain how a 19th-century inspector could have described in such detail the precise geometry of an inverted pyramid, a structure he never lived to see uncovered. Whatever they found in 1843 was not part of the earth. It was waiting to be revealed. Dequan sat quietly in the folds of Pennsylvania's coal country, a town that rarely appeared on maps, even in its own time. It was a place of narrow streets and colder faith, where the church bell tolled each dawn before the first descent into the mines. The year was 1843, and nearly every family in Dewan depended on the earth beneath them, an earth that had begun to whisper. They said the town was built on borrowed land, that the first settlers found traces of something older beneath the shale. Farmers spoke of strange stones unearthed while plowing, each carved with shallow angles they could not explain. They built their homes anyway. By the time the mining company arrived, no one remembered the stories, or pretended not to. The townspeople were practical folk. They measured worth in coal weight and Sunday attendance, but superstition traveled faster than coal carts. When Inspector Greaves vanished, word spread through the tavern that night. Some claimed he'd been crushed by a cave-in. Others said he'd followed the sound beneath the mine, that he'd gone willingly into the dark. In the weeks that followed, the mine entrance was boarded shut. The company called it a safety precaution. Yet every night, men returning from their shifts swore they could still hear the ringing, the same metallic hum Greaves had described in his letter, faint, rhythmic, rising from beneath the boards. Life in Douan began to twist around that sound. Miners refused to work near the sealed shaft. The church replaced its evening mass with morning prayer, to deny the devil his hours. Mothers forbade their children from drawing shapes in the dust. Still the symbol appeared. Triangles carved into fence posts, chalked onto school desks, traced by idle hands into condensation on windows, always inverted, always pointing down. The postmaster, one of the few literate men in town, received a parcel addressed to Greaves 2 weeks after his disappearance. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a small black triangle burned into its center. No handwriting, no seal. The ink had eaten through the paper like acid. Rumors began to surface that the mine's founders, a group of investors from Boston, had ties to the Freemasons. Their ledgers listed untraceable payments labeled only as architectural consultation. No one knew who the architect was. No one ever signed the blueprints. By winter, the miners' children had begun sleepwalking. They were found in the streets at night, standing in small groups facing the boarded mine entrance. When questioned, they all said the same thing: it's calling the earth back. The following spring, the mining company announced plans to reopen the shaft under new management. The old boards were removed. Beneath them, the ground was perfectly smooth, as if sanded. No debris, no sign of collapse, just an opening that waited. And when the first crew descended to inspect it, they reported something stranger still. The air below was colder, yes, but it smelled faintly of candle smoke, as though someone had already been there. When the miners reopened the shaft in the spring of 1844, they found the air unnaturally still. Even the sound of their boots against the ladder rung seemed to vanish a few feet below the surface. They carried lanterns, their flames trembling as if aware of the cold waiting beneath. The foreman, a man named Kavanagh, was the first to step into the chamber Greaves had described in his final letter, and what he saw would later haunt every man who followed. The walls were smooth, impossibly so, like glass poured into the shape of stone. Every few feet, a groove ran diagonally upward, converging into a point far above their heads. It took time to understand what they were standing in. The mine wasn't a tunnel at all. It was the upper tip of a shape buried upside down, carved with mathematical precision, a pyramid inverted into the bedrock. Kavanagh ordered the men to clear the surrounding debris. With each strike of their pickaxes, the echoes grew sharper, cleaner, as if hitting hollow space. One miner swore he heard the sound returning seconds later, like something inside was mimicking the rhythm. By midday, they'd revealed a section of wall large enough to sketch. The foreman's rough drawings, later retrieved from the company's records, showed angles of exactly 52 degrees, identical to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Yet the composition was unlike any known stone. A visiting geologist, Professor Lom from the University of Philadelphia, described it as black limestone with ferrous impurities. But his assistant noted something Lom did not include in the report: the fragments they collected dissolved overnight, leaving only a fine gray dust. The professor dismissed it as moisture reaction. The miners were less certain. One of them whispered that the stone didn't want to be removed. Over the next week, new details emerged. The walls were lined with faint markings, not hieroglyphs, but shallow depressions arranged in repeating groups of 7. The grooves formed what looked like stair steps, yet none large enough for a man's foot. When sunlight was reflected down the shaft using mirrors, the markings glimmered faintly, like veins of metal catching the light. Rumors spread that the pattern continued below the pit's base. Kavanaugh forbade further digging until company inspectors arrived, but the men worked by candlelight after hours, driven by a strange compulsion to expose more. Several claimed the angles seemed to shift as they carved, as if the geometry itself resisted being measured. One miner, Thomas Hall, began keeping a private journal. He wrote that while sketching the inner wall, he noticed his ruler had warped, the straight edge curving slightly inward, matching the pyramid's contour. His final entry reads, "No man can measure what is already perfect." Hall disappeared 2 nights later. His lantern was found extinguished at the bottom of the shaft, resting upright. By midsummer, the company announced a halt to all operations. The structure was to be sealed again, pending federal review. But Kavanaugh's last letter to his wife suggests otherwise. "It isn't solid stone," he wrote. It feels hollow. When the picks strike deep enough, something moves behind the wall, like pressure, like breath. The miners didn't argue when he ordered the exit boarded. They didn't even look back. Yet before the boards went up, one man marked the wall with a final stroke of chalk, tracing the outline of the triangle they'd uncovered. In the flicker of the last lantern, the mark appeared to glow, faintly alive, before fading back into the dark. The company sent 3 men down to study what the miners had found. All were professionals, engineers from Philadelphia, educated, skeptical, the sort who measured belief by the inch. Their names were recorded once in the payroll ledger, dated June 1844, James Weller, Samuel Pike, and Elias Hart. After that, no further entries were made beside their names. Only the word closed. On the morning of their descent, witnesses described them lowering their instruments by rope, surveying chains, compasses, theodolites, and laughing at the miners who crossed themselves as the cage door shut. By midday, the mine had fallen silent. The rope, when pulled, came back slack. At dusk, Kavanaugh, the foreman, ordered a retrieval. He and 2 volunteers went down as far as the pulley would take them, shouting into the dark. They heard nothing but a slow rhythmic echo like dripping water. When they reached the base of the shaft, the lantern light caught something metallic glinting at their feet. 3 notebooks, neatly stacked, bound with twine. No dust, no sign of struggle, no footprints. Just the books, and beside them a length of rope cut clean through as if by a blade. The first notebook belonged to Weller. Its pages contained precise sketches of the inverted walls, the measurements growing smaller and denser toward the end until they formed a single black triangle filling the page. The second, Pike's, contained lists of figures and a phrase repeated several times in his hand, angle constant, depth changing. The third was Hart's. A few pages of rough notes and a final entry written sideways along the margin, "We are beneath the lowest point and yet it goes further down." A second search found only their abandoned tools. One compass spun endlessly even above ground, as though something inside it had broken loose. The company sealed the shaft again, citing structural instability. The men were told the engineers had relocated after the project's closure, but rumors traveled faster than the official reports. Miners whispered that the 3 men had found a chamber below the visible structure, a hollow filled with fine gray dust that shifted as they walked, as if alive. One claimed to have seen light flicker through the boards that night, pale blue, pulsing like breath. Weeks later, the company received a package without return address. Inside were 3 miners' tags, small brass discs engraved with the missing men's initials, each bent sharply in half. There was no note. Kavanaugh kept the notebooks locked in his office. He told no one he had begun to dream of descending stairs made of black stone, each step reflecting his lantern light back into his eyes. The dreams grew so vivid that one morning he walked to the mine entrance still wearing his nightshirt. His wife found him standing before the sealed boards, his hands pressed against the wood, whispering to someone below. He left town the next day and was never seen again. The board stayed nailed shut for 5 years, until the next foreman arrived, bringing new men, new drills, and the same old question: what had the engineers found in the dark? By the summer of 1845, the company reopened the site for a limited inspection. The official reason was to assess mineral potential. Unofficially, it was to retrieve the notebooks Kavanagh had left behind. New management claimed the previous disasters were exaggerations of frightened men. But when the first crew descended, they found something no report could have prepared them for. The boards sealing the shaft were still in place, yet the ground beneath had shifted. Where the last inspection showed smooth rock, there now stood a single block, black, polished, its edges exact. It protruded from the earth like the tip of an uncut monument. At its center was an engraved mark, faintly visible under lantern light, a triangle within a circle, its apex pointed down. The men called it the capstone, though it sat at the mine's deepest point. When touched, the surface was warm. One worker, Joseph Mays, claimed it pulsed under his palm as if something inside were breathing. The others laughed, but none touched it again. They sent for the local pastor to examine the markings, thinking them some form of Masonic script. Reverend Allen Burke arrived with his Bible and a magnifying lens, insisting there was nothing unholy about geometry. Yet when he saw the symbol, his color drained. He traced the lines with his gloved finger, then stepped back and refused to enter the shaft again. That night, he burned his gloves in the churchyard fire. The following morning, Mays arrived at work shirtless, the same triangle carved into his chest with a miner's knife. He said it protected the breath of the earth. When questioned, he couldn't explain what he meant. His wound never healed properly. By autumn, he was gone, last seen walking toward the river carrying his lamp. The miners began finding smaller carvings etched into their tools, scratched into coal carts, sometimes appearing overnight in the dust of the tunnels, always the same shape. A few men claimed to hear faint chanting beneath the sound of dripping water, syllables too low to be words. Those who heard it longest said the noise came from inside their skulls. Company officials ordered the capstone covered in tar and sealed behind a wooden barrier. The men complied, but complained the sound grew worse afterward, the humming constant now, like a hidden bell. Reverend Burke left town soon after, leaving behind a sermon draft found years later in the rectory drawer. If the Lord's house is built upon the rock, then what lies beneath that rock is not of him. Beware the worship of perfect angles. They bow to no God. 2 months later, miners discovered that the tar covering had cracked open in a perfect triangle. The boards were splintered outward as if something beneath had pressed against them. None of the men would enter the shaft after that. The company suspended operations indefinitely. Years later, when surveyors mapped the old mine for closure, they noted that the capstone was no longer visible. In its place was a flat, smooth floor, untouched, unbroken, as though the block had been drawn back into the earth. The last line of the surveyor's report reads simply, symbol absent. Surface breathing faintly. By winter of 1845, the mine stood abandoned, its entrance boarded once more, the tools left to rust under frost. Yet the people of Dwan could not leave it alone. A strange comfort had begun to grow among them, a need to gather near the sealed earth, to listen. The townsfolk said the mine no longer echoed like a hollow chamber, but sang low and steady like a choir too far below to see. It began with the miners' widows. They visited the site at night, carrying candles down the valley path, lighting them before the wooden planks that sealed the shaft. They knelt in silence, whispering the names of the missing, believing perhaps their husbands could still hear. Then, in early spring, the church bell began to toll without anyone pulling its rope. The reverend was gone by then. The new preacher, Father Ellison, insisted it was only the wind, but he stopped opening the church after dusk. Within weeks, the gatherings grew larger. Men and women came at midnight, forming a circle around the mine. Some brought him books, others tools from the old tunnels, symbols of the work that had fed the town. They sang hymns at first, familiar, harmless songs. Then the words began to change. People claimed they didn't remember what they'd sung, only that the notes vibrated in their chests long after the music stopped. Children woke in the night muttering those same syllables. A school teacher, Miss Dana, wrote in her journal that her pupils had begun carving small triangles into their desks with slate pencils, as though rehearsing some lesson they were never taught. By midsummer, the gatherings moved underground. A farmer, John Ridge, cut an entry into one of the old ventilation tunnels. He told his wife he meant to check the boards, but what he found instead was a hollow carved perfectly beneath the chapel, mirroring its shape. There were candle stubs melted into the stone and footprints circling what appeared to be an altar, flat, black, with a single symbol cut deep into its surface. No one ever admitted to holding services there, yet the records tell otherwise. In the church ledger, 4 pages written in Father Ellison's hand bear the same closing line, prayer offered to the geometry beneath. The handwriting grows more hurried with each entry until the last, where ink trails into a black smear. The following week, half the town attended Sunday Mass dressed in their work clothes. The sermon lasted only 15 minutes. No one spoke after the bell tolled once as the doors were locked. That night, a traveler passing through reported seeing light flickering beneath the church floorboards, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of a human heartbeat. When the sheriff arrived 2 days later, he found the chapel empty. The pews were overturned, the altar missing, the hymn books burned to ash. The only mark on the floor was the same triangle found deep below the mine, its point driven downward, carved as if by many hands. From that night on, the valley went silent. No birds, no bells, only the faint hum of air rising from beneath the ground, as if the earth itself had learned to breathe. In November of 1845, the Federal Office of Mines sent a new team to Daquan. The local stories had reached Harrisburg. Rumors of disappearances, collapsed tunnels, and a town falling into superstition. The officials who arrived expected hysteria, not architecture. They brought engineers, surveyors, and a detachment of soldiers to keep order. The orders were simple: reopen the mine, document what was found, and confirm or deny the existence of any man-made structure below. The team reached the lowest chamber after 3 days of clearing debris. The air was heavy and cold, but there was no smell of decay, only a sterile dryness like air sealed for centuries. They set up their equipment: chains, measuring rods, lanterns, and theodolites. The instruments behaved erratically, compass needles spun, pendulums would not settle. One of the engineers, Callahan, recorded that his voice echoed 3 times, each one returning slightly delayed, as though the chamber itself spoke after him. When the dust cleared, they realized they were standing inside an inverted pyramid, a hollow that widened as it descended. The walls met at precise, impossible angles, each plane polished until it reflected their lamps in distorted fragments. They climbed downward along the sloping stone, their lights glimmering across the black surfaces. The deeper they went, the louder the vibration became, a faint, throbbing pulse that could be felt in the ribs more than heard. At the center of the structure, there was a hollow shaft running even deeper, narrower than a man's shoulders. When one of the soldiers dropped a stone into it, the sound never returned. Callahan's report later described the shaft as asterisk, a throat cut into the rock, designed to swallow sound and light alike. Asterisk. He ordered ropes secured and descended halfway before demanding to be pulled back up. The lantern he carried flickered and went out, though the wick remained unburned. That night the men camped inside the chamber. None slept. They claimed the air shifted, carrying whispers that moved from corner to corner. One soldier swore he saw movement beneath the stone surface, slow undulations as if the walls themselves were breathing. The others laughed until they saw it too, faint ripples passing through the reflection of their lamps. Yet the rock itself remained still. By dawn they had discovered carvings, lines forming a series of nested triangles, each one inverted within the next, descending toward the hollow. It was geometry within geometry, a design that seemed to repeat infinitely smaller as they traced it inward. One of the surveyors calculated that if continued, the final point would vanish into something smaller than a grain of sand. The report sent to Harrisburg included precise measurements and a single sketch labeled sectional view, structure below Daquan. It showed a pyramid turned upside down, its apex piercing into a circular void. In the margins, Callahan had written, *orientation deliberate. Built to contain, not to ascend. When they sealed the chamber again, the miners said the ground exhaled, a gust of wind so cold it extinguished every lantern. The men left in silence. No further exploration was authorized. But weeks later, residents in the town above began hearing it again. The same low hum beneath their floors, the same rhythm as a heartbeat pulsing under the soil. By early 1846, the mine stood under government seal, guarded by a handful of men who no longer believed in the safety of stone. Officially, the chamber had been declared unstable. Unofficially, no one could explain why the ground itself had begun to shift. Residents of Decoin reported vibrations at night, subtle tremors that rattled windows and made oil lamps sway on their hooks. Dogs refused to approach the valley. Wells turned bitter. And still, beneath the silence, the humming grew stronger. The collapse came without warning. On February 17, at 3 o'clock in the morning, a tremor rolled through the town. Witnesses said it sounded not like thunder, but like an exhale, a deep, drawn-out sigh from below. Within minutes, the central street began to buckle. Fissures spread outward in perfect symmetry, forming the outline of a triangle nearly 40 yards wide. Then the ground fell inward, folding over itself like closing hands. The mine swallowed 42 men. Not one body was recovered. A woman named Lydia Cobb, who lived near the site, later told investigators she had seen light pour upward from the earth as it caved, not fire, not lanterns, but a cold blue glow that bent the air around it. Her account was dismissed as hysteria. Yet when officials surveyed the crater, they found that the debris formed a precise shape, the triangle once again inverted, its angles aligned to the cardinal points. Inspector Callahan returned from Harrisburg 2 days later to supervise the recovery. His notes survive only in fragments, but what remains reads more like confession than report. The structure did not collapse. It folded itself shut. There is intelligence in its design. It breathes still, though buried. Excavation efforts failed. Each time they dug into the fallen rock, new layers slid inward as though resisting exposure. Shovels bent, carts overturned, lanterns died without smoke or flame. The men worked only in daylight. By dusk, the vibration beneath their feet was enough to make the soil pulse like a drum. A week later, Callahan ordered a final attempt. They drove timbers deep into the crater for stability and lowered ropes between them. The first man who descended shouted that the walls below were smooth again. Then the rope jerked and went slack. When they hauled it back, it came up clean. No blood, no torn fibers, as if it had passed through air. The collapse site was filled with gravel and sealed with stone. The official report labeled it a geological event. The government men left, but Dwan did not recover. Half the town moved away that spring, leaving doors unlatched and furniture behind. Those who stayed said the nights had grown too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the low, rhythmic pulse underfoot, the same cadence that once guided their drills. Years later, farmers working the hills claimed that after heavy rain, the soil sank slightly near the old pit, drawing down in 3 sharp lines. They swore it always formed the same shape, a triangle, pointing down. By 1850, the town was no longer called Dequan. The surviving families, desperate to distance themselves from the tragedy, renamed it New Dequan, as though renaming could cleanse the ground beneath their feet. Houses were rebuilt on the higher ridge, streets redrawn, the old crater filled and paved into what locals called the Founders Square. Beneath that square lay 42 men, their names etched in no registry, their deaths attributed to a mine collapse of indeterminate cause. The new settlers arrived with optimism and ignorance. To them, the valley was rich in coal and history, nothing more. Yet the census records from 1850 show something inexplicable. The town's population had doubled since the disaster, though no new families were recorded arriving from surrounding counties. The handwriting in those census ledgers wavers in the middle pages, as though the enumerator's hand trembled. One note scribbled in the margin reads, asterisk, many names repeated, though no duplicate persons found. Asterisk. The newcomers were indistinguishable from those who had left. Same surnames, same faces, sometimes the same birth dates. A miner named Enoch Dale returned to his home after 5 years away and found another man living there with his wife and children, a man who claimed to be Enoch Dale as well. The townspeople, uncertain whom to believe, began calling them First Dale and Second Dale. No law was passed, no argument settled. Both men continued living in the same town until they vanished together the following winter. The mine itself was never reopened, but its memory persisted in strange ways. At night, residents heard rhythmic knocks beneath their floors, like someone tapping from below. Lamps dimmed whenever the church bell rang. Children began drawing in the dust, not pictures of people or animals, but geometric shapes, triangles nested inside one another, all pointing down. When asked where they learned them, they said, asterisk, it's what the earth remembers. Asterisk. In 1851, the school teacher compiled an anthology of her pupils' writings titled Lessons from the Hollow. Only one copy survived, now brittle with age. In its final pages, a child had written in careful script, asterisk, the town under the town is still building. Asterisk. That same year, the town council erected a monument at the center of Founders Square, a simple stone pillar to honor the miners who had perished. During its construction, the masons uncovered a layer of black limestone beneath the soil, perfectly smooth, unweathered. When sunlight hit it, the surface shimmered faintly as if alive. They paved over it and told no one. By autumn, a fine tremor ran through the ground each night, so subtle that only those lying awake could feel it. The mayor, in his annual address, dismissed talk of haunting as collective fatigue, insisting the town's prosperity was proof of divine favor. But in the archives of the county courthouse, a final line appears at the end of his letter to the state, asterisk, we built over the old earth, yet it builds still beneath us. The soil moves when it sleeps. Asterisk. No further correspondence followed. And though the records list New Daquan as thriving through the 1850s, not a single photograph of the town from that decade exists. Only the foundation stones remain, forming by some curious design the faint outline of a triangle. By 1853, the people of New Daquan had grown used to small disturbances, the subtle tremors, the dimming lamps, the sense that the air carried a low hum beneath every silence. They no longer spoke of it aloud, but the children did. The first to notice were their teachers, who found chalk triangles filling the blackboards each morning before lessons began. The lines were exact, their angles precise, too perfect for a child's hand. Each shape pointed downward. Miss Harlow, the schoolmistress, thought it mischief. She washed the marks away, but the next day they reappeared, drawn deeper into the slate, faintly etched as if cut with a knife. One evening she stayed behind to catch the culprit. By lamplight, she watched as a student, 10-year-old Clara Wells, stood from her seat and traced invisible lines on the air before the chalk began to move on its own. When Miss Harlow called out, Clara turned. Her eyes were open, but she was still asleep. The next morning, Clara remembered nothing. Yet when asked why she drew the triangles, she whispered, asterisk, it's what the ground looks like when it dreams. Asterisk. Soon every child in the town began sketching the same forms on windows, in dust, even on their own skin. Parents scrubbed the marks off only to find them again the next day. Some said the children spoke to one another in whispers that weren't words, a rhythm of humming and breath. At night, candles in their bedrooms flickered in unison, the flames bending inward as though toward some unseen current. Doctors came from the nearby city to study what they called collective somnambulism. They interviewed the children, asked them to redraw what they'd seen. The sketches they produced showed the same structure, layer upon layer of inverted triangles descending into darkness. When arranged together, the drawings formed a larger pattern, one that matched the precise dimensions recorded in Callahan's forbidden survey 8 years earlier. One physician, Dr. Harlan Coe, wrote in his notes that the children's pulse quickened whenever they held a compass, as though their hearts beat to the rhythm of magnetic north. He burned his notes before leaving town, but his assistant later recalled a single phrase scrawled across the last page, asterisk, the pattern remembers itself. Asterisk. As weeks passed, the drawings became more elaborate. Some children began digging small holes in their yards, always triangular, always to the same depth. They filled them with pebbles and left them uncovered, claiming it helped them breathe better at night. When the parents filled the holes in, the children wept until the next dawn. On the evening of March the 12th, a storm rolled through the valley. Lightning struck the schoolhouse roof, splitting it open. Amid the rain and ash, the remaining wall stood scorched with a single black mark, an inverted pyramid burned clean through the wood. The children were found huddled together inside, uninjured, but silent, staring upward through the broken ceiling. Miss Harlow said they were watching the sky as if it were the floor of some deeper place. That night she wrote one final entry in her journal before leaving New Douan forever, asterisk, they say children see heaven first, but I think they see what waits beneath it. Asterisk. For more than 20 years, the ground of New Douan remained sealed. The mine had been declared a safety hazard, off-limits to prospectors and engineers alike. Yet in 1871, a new mining syndicate purchased the land under a false name, claiming they sought to reopen the coal veins. They called themselves the Hollow Ridge Company, though no records of its incorporation were ever found. The first men who arrived in town wore uniforms without insignia. They carried no Bibles, only instruments of measure, and a single map marked with an inverted triangle. By the second week of July, drilling had begun again. The workers reported that the soil beneath the old square was unlike any other in the region, dense, almost metallic, producing sparks when struck by iron tools. On the fourth day, their drills pierced through a hollow space. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it a smell like iron and rain-soaked stone. The foreman, Elias Grant, noted in his field log that the air seemed to move with intention, as though drawn toward the living. The company's first report to Harrisburg described an architectural anomaly 20 feet below the surface, a series of chambers descending in precise geometric patterns, smaller and smaller toward the bottom. Each layer mirrored the last, forming a perfect nesting of pyramids inverted within one another. Grant compared it to asterisk, a reflection repeating itself in dark glass. Asterisk. As they dug deeper, the vibrations returned. The miners called it the heartbeat. No one could locate its source. It pulsed through rock, through tools, through their own chests. The men began working in silence, timing their strikes to match the rhythm. One evening, a surveyor noticed their picks hitting stone in unison, perfectly synchronized, though no one had spoken. He left the site that night and never came back. By August, they reached a black limestone slab. And like the rest, when tapped, it rang like hollow iron. The engineers removed a small section and peered inside. What they saw was recorded only once in a report now missing from federal archives. But a surviving letter from one of the contractors describes it in 4 words, asterisk, a structure within motion. Asterisk. Soon after, the drilling ceased. The workers began collapsing. They were not injured, only unresponsive, standing upright with their eyes open, breathing in rhythm with the pulse beneath the ground. Grant wrote that he tried to wake them, shouting into their faces, but their bodies swayed gently like trees in a wind that no one else could feel. The excavation ended abruptly on September the 3rd when a tremor split the central pit. A column of light, pale and blue, rose for a moment and then vanished, leaving the tools melted into the ground. The remaining men filled the hole with soil and fled. A government delegation arrived weeks later, sealing the valley once again. The Hollow Ridge Company dissolved without trace, its investors never identified. In the State Archive, a single memorandum survives from that year, unsigned and half-burned. It reads, asterisk, do not disturb the layers. They are closing themselves. Every smaller pyramid beats faster than the one before. Asterisk. After 1871, the tremors ceased. The hum was gone. But those who lived nearby said the silence felt heavier, as though the earth below had finally begun to sleep. When the government sealed New Douan for the second time, only one official record of the 1871 excavation was ever completed. It bore the title Survey Report, Subterranean Structure Below Carbon Valley, and it was signed by a name long presumed dead, Inspector Gregory Callahan, the same man who had led the descent 26 years earlier. No one knows where he had been in those missing decades. His handwriting, once measured and clear, now sprawled unevenly across the pages, its ink pressed deep into the paper as though written in a tremor. The report was never submitted through official channels. It was found instead in 1902, sealed within a steel case beneath the floorboards of an abandoned boarding house in Harrisburg. The opening page reads like a confession rather than a statement of fact. I have seen the shape beneath cone, and it is not the work of man. We built our pyramids to reach the heavens, but this was carved downward to hold something that should not rise. He described the chamber as larger than before, alive with vibration. The walls, he wrote, seemed to shift when unobserved, the angles bending as though they were breathing. He noted faint metallic resonance in the air, a low tone that moved between frequencies faster than the human ear could perceive. It vibrated through my ribs, matching the rhythm of my own pulse until I could no longer tell which belonged to me. Faces in the angles, he wrote. Not carved, not reflections, but living facets of geometry. They move when I look away. They learn the shape of thought. Callahan's team, 12 men in all, began to experience confusion, misplaced hours, sentences unfinished, moments of blindness in which they swore they saw the chamber from above, as though standing inside its reflection. One soldier began to scream that the light from his lantern had turned inside out, illuminating dark nests instead of stone. 3 of them vanished overnight. Their bed rolls were untouched, their boots neatly arranged. The ground beneath their tents was warm to the touch. By the end of his journal, Callahan's sentences fragment into shorter lines, almost poetic, as if language itself were failing him. It was meant to contain. It is beginning to fail. The breath of the earth grows quicker. The shape remembers us. The final entry ends abruptly. Below his signature is a smudge of ash, fingerprint-shaped, pressed into the paper. The ink surrounding it is scorched as if by heat. The remaining pages are blank until the very last, where faint indentations reveal words written with the pen long since dry. Do not open it again. If you hear the hum beneath your feet, you are already standing in its shadow. The steel case holding his report was found warped inward, edges fused as though melted from the outside. When archivists opened it, the air inside was warm. Impossibly so, considering the century that had passed. Callahan was never found. His name, once struck from government record, was later read under a new heading, presumed active. To this day, the signature at the bottom of that report glows faintly under lamplight, as if the ink still remembers being written. In the spring of 1903, a memorandum quietly circulated through the Bureau of Geological Survey in Washington, D.C. It bore no title, no author, and no seal of approval. Only a red wax stamp marked for internal reference. Inside were 7 pages of fragmented correspondence, all referring to what they called Containment Site 3, Dauquan, Pennsylvania. The report was never meant for public record. Each line was written in the dry administrative tone of government work. Yet the language betrays unease. Localized magnetic distortion persists, one paragraph reads. And structural symmetry maintains without measurable decay. Another states, recommends site remains sealed. Comparative analysis indicates similar subsurface formations in Kansas and Northern California. 3 other containment sites. No addresses, no coordinates, each one redacted with thick black ink. The archivist who later catalogued the report noted something peculiar about its formatting. The paper had been typed on two different machines. One standard for the era, another unknown, its typeface impossibly precise, the letters carved too deep, as if etched rather than struck. When light passed across the page, the indentations formed faint triangular patterns invisible from above. Among the attachments was a single photograph, a grainy aerial image of the Daquan Valley taken from a military balloon. The landscape appeared unremarkable at first glance, a patchwork of fields and narrow roads, until the eye adjusted. Beneath the pale crop lines, an enormous geometric depression stretched for nearly half a mile, faint but unmistakable. A triangle inverted, its edges too straight to be natural. No one in the department claimed authorship of the report. Those who handled it later described a mild vibration through the paper, as though it retained a memory of the ground from which it came. One archivist, Helen Drew, wrote in her personal log that she suffered recurring headaches after reviewing the files. Her final entry, dated May 9, 1903, reads, **, the pattern prints itself even through gloves. **. That summer, a classified directive was issued ordering the permanent stabilization of the Daquan site. Local records show the sudden construction of a new water reservoir in the valley, a convenient public works project built directly atop the old mine. Photographs of its foundation revealed that the concrete was poured in a triangular mold. Engineers claimed the shape distributed pressure evenly, yet the design has never appeared in any other American dam. Within the Bureau, rumors spread that the report's original author was Callahan himself, though he would have been nearly 80 years old. The signature on the final page was unreadable, consisting only of 3 lines intersecting at a single downward point. The official archive lists the Daquan file as closed, 1903. Yet one copy remained unsealed. Decades later, when the box was reopened for cataloging, the paper inside had turned black, the ink reversed to white, as if the document itself had been photographed from within. Those who examined it described the same faint pulse through the pages, rhythmic, deliberate, and alive. No one has handled it since. In the summer of 1942, the United States Geological Survey commissioned a series of aerial photographs across Pennsylvania. The purpose was routine, mapping mineral deposits for wartime production. When the photographs of Carbon County arrived at the Department of Mines, the technician who developed them, a young man named Walter Briggs, noticed something that didn't belong. At first, it appeared as a shallow depression in the valley north of the town once called Daquan. But when the images were placed side by side, taken at 5-minute intervals, the shape began to reveal itself. It was no ordinary sinkhole. The edges were exact, forming a triangle nearly half a mile wide, its lines straight enough to cut the horizon. And strangest of all, it hadn't been there in the images from just the year before. Briggs brought the negatives to his supervisor, who dismissed them as camera distortion. Yet when the films were examined under magnification, faint striations appeared within the triangle, concentric layers, each smaller, repeating downward, like steps carved into shadow. Briggs wrote in a private memo, **, a reconnaissance plane was sent to verify the anomaly. The pilot, Captain Dean Morasey, later testified that his compass spun continuously as the aircraft passed over the valley. Radio communication cut in and out, replaced by a steady, rhythmic tone, the same pattern recorded in 1871 by Callahan's men, though none aboard could have known that. The captain's log, recovered years later, includes the line, *, it was as if something beneath us was speaking in pulses. The photographs were classified immediately. Analysts at Wright Field attempted to overlay them with earlier survey maps, but discovered discrepancies in scale. The valley itself appeared to have shifted by several degrees. The cartographers assumed a measurement error until they noticed that local landmarks, rows of fences, even the creek, had subtly bent around the depression, curving as if drawn toward its center. In October of that year, the Army Corps dispatched a small ground team under the guise of geological assessment. Locals remembered the trucks arriving at night, their headlights blacked out, their engines muffled. The men carried portable seismographs and left before dawn. No official report from that expedition survives, but a maintenance worker at the State Archive later claimed to have read a single page that escaped destruction. It described magnetic and acoustic interference consistent with low-frequency oscillation, and ended with a brief handwritten note, asterisk, the compass fails again. The ground is breathing. Asterisk. After 1942, the valley was fenced off and labeled a restricted testing zone. No flights were permitted below 3,000 feet. When the reservoir water receded during the drought of '43, farmers reported seeing a faint glimmer under the surface, like polished stone catching the moonlight. By morning, it was gone. Briggs left government service that same year. Before his death in 1972, he told a reporter that he still saw the images in his sleep. It wasn't a shadow, he said. Asterisk, it was a window. Asterisk, and I think, he didn't finish the sentence. The tape of that interview ends with a low, steady hum that no technician has ever been able to remove. The official record lists the anomaly as asterisk, topographical distortion due to lens defect. Asterisk, but those who have viewed the surviving photographs agree on one detail: the triangle's lines were too perfect, its center too dark. It looked less like an absence, they said, and more like an opening. By the time the century turned, there was no coin on any map of Pennsylvania. The roads that once led to it ended in forest. Locals from neighboring towns spoke of an old mining settlement that had drowned, though no river ran through the valley. If one looked hard enough, they could find the faint trace of a causeway beneath the weeds. A road that led nowhere, splitting in the shape of a downward point. The government called the area a conservation zone. Survey records listed it as uninhabited terrain, unsuitable for agriculture. Yet, in aerial photos taken decades apart, the forest canopy always appeared slightly different. Trees bending inward, shadows aligning at impossible angles, forming a faint geometric pattern that only emerged when the images were laid atop one another. In 1979, a group of geology students from Philadelphia University stumbled upon the perimeter fence while conducting field research. The sign read, asterisk, federal property, do not enter. Asterisk, though no agency was specified, one of the students, Michael Reed, ignored the warning. He followed the slope down through the trees and found the ground changing underfoot, the soil growing darker, smoother, almost metallic. Then came the sound. A vibration so low it barely reached the ear, yet strong enough to make his teeth ache. Reed described what he saw in a single notebook page recovered after his disappearance, asterisk, the earth isn't solid here. It's moving, slow and deliberate, like something turning in its sleep. Beneath the moss are seams, 3 of them meeting in a perfect point. They lead down. I think there's still a chamber below. Asterisk. 2 days later, the remaining students returned to the site with local authorities. There was no sign of Reed, no footprints, no disturbed soil, only his notebook and his camera, both lying beside a shallow depression in the shape of a triangle. The final photograph on his roll shows the forest canopy bending inward toward the lens as though drawn by invisible gravity. The negatives warped in storage, the image melting into a black spiral. In 1994, a private survey drone captured a thermal image of the valley while mapping nearby fault lines. The data showed a perfect geometric void beneath the surface, colder than the surrounding Earth, expanding fraction by fraction each year. Engineers dismissed it as equipment error. Yet one of them, a technician named Grace Holloway, sent an anonymous letter to the Harrisburg Tribune. It was never published, but a copy survives in the State Archive, asterisk, they paved over something alive. The reservoir was built to drown it, but it's still there, still breathing, and the ground above it moves, though only when no one is watching. Asterisk. Today, the valley is known to hikers as the Hollow Forest, an empty patch of green between counties. No one lives within 5 miles of it. Compasses still fail near the ridge. Birds avoid flying directly overhead. And in the rare satellite photos taken during drought years, a faint triangular scar can be seen beneath the surface of the earth, darker than the soil around it, a shadow of perfect proportion. There are no graves, no records, no mention of Tkone in official history. It is as if the town never existed. But some nights, when the wind is still and the valley air carries no sound, the ground vibrates with the faintest hum. Steady, patient, familiar. Perhaps pyramids were never meant to reach the sky. Perhaps they were built to hold the earth down.